Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with 10 standard orchestral works. I think they're standard. Yeah, they're standard orchestral works that I discovered much later than I should have. And, it's very funny because everybody comes to music at their own pace, right? And you like to think that you follow a certain progression. And there is a certain progression if you are coming from a place where there's classical music culture and tradition in your family. I'm talking about your home life, not like, the universe at large or your country. But, there is a certain standard progression. Like you're supposed to love Bach and you're supposed to get into Beethoven and Mozart and think that they're the bee's knees. And then you listen to Schumann and Schubert and Chopin, and maybe you get to Brahms and Tchaikovsky, and then all hell breaks loose in the 20th century. And they're just these pieces that everyone assumes that you know and that you've heard. But my indoctrination into classical music was personal to me. It was not normal. It really wasn't. I started to like the things I liked because I just loved music. I listened to records that my parents had and my grandparents had. And then I started cutting lawns for a living and taking my money and going to Goodwill in Milford, Connecticut and buying whatever they had in the budget bids. And they had strange things. They had early Dvorak symphonies and they had all kinds of stuff. And I was never told what's great and what isn't great. All I was told was, here's music. Go for it. So I liked classical stuff. I liked Peter, Paul, and Mary. I liked my mother's collections. I liked Harry Belafonte. Oh my God, Calypso was my favorite record for years. I liked Broadway show tunes and musicals and all kinds of things. It was all one big happy musical jumble. And as a result of that, because I didn't have any guidance, specific guidance, I simply learned to like what I liked, and there were certain lacunae in my musical knowledge, which I didn't. So music that just never struck me or impressed me, or I didn't come across, or until much, much later in my life, and even as a critic, because as a critic, I started out doing the things I felt most comfortable talking about, the things I liked and the things that I really knew. And it was only over the years as a professional, when you're called upon to review things that maybe you haven't heard or didn't know as well, you wind up having to do those. So here's the list of 10. The list is down below. And I'd be curious to know, what basic repertoire pieces did you never hear? Even if for those of you who are basically well-read, well-listened classical music people, what are the pieces that somehow slipped through the cracks when you were going through your initial indoctrination? So let me begin. Handel Concerti Grossi Opus 6. Everybody loves the Handel Concerti Grossi Opus 6. I don't know anybody who has a word to say against him. I didn't like him. It's not that I knew them and didn't like them. I just heard bits of them and thought, it's Baroque. It's like the Four Seasons. I have that. It sounds the same. Well, it doesn't sound the same. That's absolutely ridiculous. You have to actually listen to them and you realize they sound like Handel and like nobody else. But what really turned me off to the Handel Concerti Grossi and prevented me from getting to know them as well as I should is that when I was working in community orchestras, the string players always wanted to play the Handel Concerti Grossi. And they never wanted to play anything that, first of all, had percussion parts that I could play, or that the brass or woodwind people wanted to do. All they wanted was Handel Concerti Grossi. I don't know why. I don't know why it was a thing in a couple of these orchestras I was in, but it was. And I just developed a certain contempt for that part of the orchestra and for, the works that they wanted to perform, which was such an idiotic thing on my part because they were so right and I was so wrong. And finally, after some time went by, I actually started listening to them and paying attention. And I was like, whoa, this is hot stuff. These are gorgeous. It's fabulous. It's beautiful. Yeah, it is. And now I love them. I just love them to bits and have hundreds of recordings of them and can't stop listening to them. And it took a long time. It took a very long time. I have no excuse. Next, Schumann Symphony No. 2. Now, my first acquaintance with Schumann symphonies was the Rhenish. And I loved the Rhenish, especially the Giulini Los Angeles recording that came out, which just had that wonderful surge to it and and incredible horns, because he used Mahler's orchestration, actually, in the first movement at least. And it was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful. And I really, really enjoyed the Rhenish. The other Schumann symphonies struck me as somehow, well, just not terribly interesting. I mean, I don't know why. There was something about Schumann generally that struck me as not terribly interesting. I've talked about that before. I never quite got Carnival either. His melodic shape and style and idiom, I found somehow cloying or foursquare, or it's taken me a long time to digest Schumann. But gradually I incorporated the other symphonies. I learned to adore the fourth. I got the Sawallisch Dresden Schumann cycle, which is amazing. But somehow, even enjoying the Spring and the Rhenish and the fourth, number two just kind of passed me by. And it's kind of funny because in some ways it's the most perfect of the batch. It has no problems in terms of orchestration. It is wonderfully written in cyclical form, with a motto theme that comes back. It's all based on Mendelssohn's Scottish symphony, sort of structurally speaking. And it has one of Schumann's the only great symphonic adagio that he ever wrote. It's a beautiful, beautiful movement. The scherzo is delightful. It's a wonderful piece. A wonderful, wonderful piece. But I think I just always heard it in bad circumstances. I remember one particularly dreadful concert with Bernhard Haitink, and the Concerto, I guess it was. I usually loved seeing them come, but Haitink could be as dour and miserable as anybody. And his recorded Schumann symphonies were terribly, terribly dull and undercharacterized. And he did a concert that had Dawn on the Moskva River and Shostakovich's Sixth on the first half. And then the second half was Schumann's second. And that pissed me off. And the reason it pissed me off is because that was bad programming. The Schumann second uses the smallest orchestra. The Shostakovich has, like I said, percussion and brilliance and that sort of, 20th century tang and high spirits and raucousness. And it really makes a great ending to a concert. And I knew that. Because I knew that work very, very well. And then the second half was going to be the Schumann. Why? Well, because it was the German work. And I disliked this suggestion that because it was the work of the great German symphonist, it had to be the climax of the concert. And that people who liked things like brilliance and rhythm were somehow inferior to those who were seeking the higher qualities that you could find in this, comparatively speaking, rather gaunt and ordinary sounding symphony. Well, it's not an ordinary symphony. It's a spectacular symphony. But that's how I felt about it, that I had a resentment towards it almost, because people seemed to be tugging out these pieces when there was so much more interesting music to listen to, or so I thought at the time. So it took me a while to get there. It really, really did. The next one is Beethoven's Fourth Piano Concerto, which I just talked about, and which is one of the nearest and dearest to my heart pieces of music that anyone ever wrote. I just think it's glorious. But when I was in high school, I had a friend who was learning Beethoven's Fourth Piano Concerto, and he said to me, "Oh my God, it's nothing but 30 minutes of arpeggios." And I didn't really know it. Again, I keep coming back to this, right? It's all about listening, isn't it? We have to keep on listening. We have to listen, take these things on their own terms. He told me it was all arpeggios. I listened to it. I heard 30 minutes of arpeggios. I put it away and vowed never to listen to it again. Boy, was that my mistake. Of course, I got over it. I got over it eventually. But for years and years, I just dismissed the piece completely as a pale shadow of the Emperor Concerto, which had all kinds of more fun arpeggios in it, until I learned better. But for years, I was just turned off by Beethoven's Fourth Piano Concerto. And I kick myself now, but everything happens in its own time, I think, as long as you keep on listening. After the Beethoven, Brahms Symphony No. 2. Well, we were a Brahms Symphony No. 1 family. My mother loved the Brahms first, just adored the Brahms first. She played it all the time. We went to see it live. We saw the Israel Philharmonic under Zubin Mehta do it in Woolsey Hall in New Haven. That was the performance where some guy fell asleep and woke up in the middle of it and started madly applauding, and the whole orchestra laughed and broke down, and Zubin turned around and glared at him, and it was very, very funny. But I loved the first. I really did. And the first is, of course, full of Sturm und Drang and turmoil and tension. The second, well, it's different. It's the opposite of the first in many ways. And it's largely sunny and lyrical. And it seems to take its time unfolding things. And I thought it was just the dullest piece of music in the universe. I never even got to the finale half the time. I just passed out halfway through the second movement. I'd given up already on the thing. Never liked it. And I kept being told, people kept telling me very loudly, well, it's the most popular Brahms symphony. It's the most frequently recorded. It's the one everybody loves. And I'm like, no, I like the first. Second, who cares? Well, of course, I got over that too eventually. It took time and listening. And now, of course, I love it. It's wonderful. It's terrific. I get it. It has amazing things, many, many amazing things. And it is in a lot of respects a more accomplished work than the first. But I was in no position to make that determination for many, 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 many years. Next, Liszt, Les Préludes. Well, nobody is being forced to like Liszt tone poems. They should, actually, because there's some really good music in the Liszt tone poems, really fun music and enjoyable music. But Les Préludes is a piece that everybody seemed to know. I knew the tune. Da, ba, ba, da, da, dum, bum, 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 ba. I mean, I knew the tune. But the work itself, I somehow managed to avoid it. I managed to avoid it until I think it was my sophomore year in college. I was in the newly formed Johns Hopkins Symphony Orchestra. And it was one of the first things we did. I think we played it on our first concert, actually. It may have been. And that was how I learned it, by actually playing it and sitting in the back of the orchestra and listening to how it goes. And my goodness, what a fun time we had. It was a joy from beginning to end. And you wind up sitting there going like, where has this been all your life? Why have I paid no attention to it? I had recordings of it. I must have had half a dozen recordings of it. I'd managed not to listen to any of them. I really did. I just sort of skipped over them. It's like, Liszt, like Preludes, yuck. And then I heard it and played it and went, gee, this is a rousing good time, isn't it? And after Liszt, Mozart. Mozart, another one who you're just supposed to mindlessly adore. Symphony No. 39 in E-flat, the one with the clarinets. I'm trying to think what happened with 39 was most of the recordings that you bought in those days had 40 and 41 coupled, on two sides of an LP. Zell, for example, you had Zell Mozart or Bruno Walter, you'd get 40 and 41, or you'd get 35, 38, 40, and 41. And it was very strange. You get it was not the Paris Symphony, the Prague Symphony and the Hafner, because they had nicknames. So you got the two last ones and you got the two late ones that had nicknames, because you would remember them. It was a marketing thing. It really was. Go back and look. You'll see. It's really funny how it worked out. 39 always got left out. And you only started to get them if you got like box sets that had like the last 6 symphonies all at once or something. I couldn't afford that at the time. And when CDs started coming out too, you started seeing 39, put in where it belonged. But 40 and 41, one was the Jupiter, one was the Great G minor. I mean, everyone heard it. And then the 2 named symphonies, those were the late Mozart symphonies. And 39 was conspicuous by its absence. So opportunities to hear it, even though there were wonderful performances of it all over the place, and everyone was recording them who did the late Mozart symphonies, somehow 39 did not get the attention that the others got. And I just let it drift right by because I didn't think it mattered terribly much, because nobody else was talking about it. It never got a nickname. And, what are you going to call it? The mellow. It is. It's very mellow. And very, the finale is wonderful, but it has an ending that actually seems to stop in the middle of something. And I just... Then one day, I was listening to Klemperer's late Mozart, and I put on his number 39, and kerplooey, I said to myself, where has this been all my life? Why haven't I paid any attention to this symphony? I blame our musical culture, which always takes the easy way out when it comes to these things. Then the Bach orchestral suites. Well, Bach wrote very little orchestral music. There were the Brandenburg concertos, there were the other concertos, the keyboard concertos, and the 4 orchestral suites. And that's really about it. And so they were considered to be a very, very big deal. But I disliked the Baroque style. Those overtures and those jerky rhythms and the strange high trumpet things belching out at random spots, and then the sort of fugal harpsichord things, and then a bunch of dances. And it all sounded to me so totally trivial. I mean, yes, I knew the air on a G string, and I knew that bourrée thing or whatever, dum ba da da, dum ba da da, dum ba da dum ba da 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 da, yeah, from the D major suite. I knew bits of them. I really did, and they just made no impression on me at all. Like a lot of Bach, frankly. I mean, I have to say. But those particularly, it seemed to me that the regard in which they were held and the amount of attention they got, rather like the Handel Concerti Grossi, to be honest with you, was completely undeserved. You could listen to so much other music that seemed to me more powerful, more colorful, more successful, or more interesting from an orchestral point of view. And so I had to wait. I waited and I waited. And the performance that turned me on to the Bach orchestral suites was one on period instruments. It was Sigiswald Kuijken, his group with, I think it was with La Petite Band, was it? On Harmonia Mundi or Deutsche Harmonia Mundi, I think, is what it was. But it was one of the first period instrument ones. And I think it was maybe it was released on Pro Arte. I don't even remember. It was so long ago. And they were on LPs. I don't have the LPs anymore. I have those performances, but I have them on CD now. And oh my, what a difference that made. Now that really turned me on, first of all, to period instrument performance, but also to what they could do to wake up and make you pay attention to music that you thought was just kind of old and drab. That's how I looked at it. And as a lot of people did, I think, who were not familiar with Baroque music, with the idiom and the style. But yeah, really, really special stuff now. I have no problem with it. And Schubert. Oh, Schubert Symphony No. 5. I was an unfinished guy, a Schubert unfinished guy. I love the unfinished. My mother loved the unfinished. She used to dust and vacuum to the unfinished. And I just adored it, every bit of it. And then I got into the great ninth, the C major symphony, which is also, really, really colossal and special and different. And then there was the fifth, which was often an accompaniment to the unfinished. It was the thing the other ones forget about. They weren't even on my radar at that time. The only other Schubert symphony besides 8 and 9 that people really sort of knew back in the 60s or paid much attention to, unless you were a really hardcore connoisseur, which when I was in high school, I couldn't say I was the fifth. People knew the fifth. But I put on the fifth, and I said to myself, it just sounds like, a Mozart wannabe. Well, Schubert was a Mozart wannabe, nowhere more so than in the fifth. But, ooh, what a great Mozart wannabe he was. I had to get past my disinterest in Mozart and the 39th Symphony and all that stuff before I could go back and really appreciate and enjoy Schubert's fifth, which is simply music in a style, but beautiful, gorgeous music in a style, sensitive and luscious. And where was I? What was I thinking? I don't know. You want to kick yourself later. But everything has its time, like I said. And after Schubert and Mendelssohn, the Scottish Symphony. Now, the Scottish Symphony, as I've discussed in this channel many times, is one of the most important and fascinating symphonies in the entire Romantic period. It was the model for all of the symphonies that came after, so many of them anyway, that used cyclic form with a motto theme and partially programmatic. I mean, there's a storm in the first movement, and the finale is Martha Allegro Guerrerico. It's supposed to be battle-type music. And wow, what a great piece. And there's no issue when it comes to color and orchestration and sonority. I mean, Mendelssohn was a master of all that stuff. But I liked the Italian Symphony. I'm not sure why I liked the Italian Symphony so much better than the Scottish Symphony. Maybe because it was shorter. Maybe because it was bright. It was bright and brilliant, and the Scottish is a dark work. It's a minor key work. It's heavier in all respects. But it just, again, it just went by until eventually one day I was listening. I guess it was, oh my, Leonard Bernstein with perhaps with the Israel Philharmonic, the Deutsche Grammophon recording that he made with them, that just really, really rocked my boat. I thought it was a stunning performance, and I finally, began to enjoy the rest of the Mendelssohn symphonies around that too. The first, which nobody ever plays, and which is simply marvelous, and even the Lobgesang, which I thought was one of the dullest pieces in the world, but actually is quite beautiful and very lively, really very lively work. It took time, but eventually I got there. I definitely got there. And last but not least, there was Strauss, Death and Transfiguration. And I despised Death and Transfiguration, even though I got to play tam-tam in it, because that's the only percussion part in it aside from timpani. And I was the tam-tam person in my community orchestra when we did Death and Transfiguration. I just thought it was the most pretentious piece of musical hokum that anybody ever came up with. I mean, Death, Transfiguration. I mean, what is it doing? I just thought the whole concept was stupid. And then, even after playing it, I mean, I enjoyed playing it. I did. I mean, I got through it, and it was okay. And I did wonderful things with the tam-tam parts. I did the most exquisite diminuendo from mezzo, forte to piano, as Strauss indicates. I mean, I was really, really very dedicated to that tam-tam part. But what really got me was Toscanini's recording of it in one of those remastered Toscanini editions, because it was just a performance of such clarity, such rhythmic clarity and strength and tension. And I just was like, wow, this is a freaking masterpiece. It really is. And after that, I began to appreciate other performances. I see in the comments quite often, well, I've heard performance X, and because I love performance X, I can't love anything else. Everything else pales in comparison. I'm just the opposite. And I recommend that you try to be too. When I hear a performance of something that really turns me on to it, that I think is absolutely fabulous, I immediately want to hear different versions. And I find myself more open, not less, to what the music has to express and to what it has to offer, because I know that everyone's been playing it, and there's a whole world of interpretation out there that I don't know and I'm curious about. Once I've gotten my way in, then the sky's the limit, and I hope you feel that way too. In fact, I hope that's kind of the moral of this entire story. Get into it, however you need to get into it, and then follow your own path and make something wonderful of the time you have to spend. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me, and let me know what pieces you wish you'd gotten to know sooner than you ultimately did. Take care.